The world of Pokemon is one unlike many other franchises. In it, we have a colorful variety of landmarks, regions, and most importantly, Pokemon. To be exact, there are now over 1,000 different species of them spanning across 9 unique regions. It's almost impossible to remember them all at this point. However, throughout Pokemon's history, there have been shining stars amongst the nearly infinite pile of partners, those who have proven themselves to be staples in any Pokemon playthrough. But for every great Pokemon, there are countless others left in the shadows, overlooked and underused. Today, I'm going to be giving them the spotlight and seeing how they can be hypothetically fixed to be more desirable in their respective generations. I've already covered the first 6 generations, so if you want to see the fixes I made for them, check those videos out once you're done. But now, let's take a look at the worst modern Pokemon. To start, let's look at a Pokemon that seems perfectly fine at first glance. Vikavolt. This has to be one of the coolest bug Pokemon designs ever. I mean, an electric beetle that's shaped like a railgun? How could you not like it? Unfortunately though, it has arguably the most bizarre and unexplainable stat distribution of any Pokemon. Yes, even more than the cat. Apparently, Vikavolt zips around and flusters opponents with acrobatic flying maneuvers, which is perfectly illustrated with a base 43 speed stat. I get that its special attack is amazing, but did they really have to make it slower than Caterpie? It's also made worse when you realize that you can't evolve Charjabug until the very end of the game in Gen 7, so Vikavolt really should be a much better reward. So yeah, stat-wise, this is a very straightforward fix. I'd lower its physical attack, physical defense, and special defense by 10 each and give it to its speed stat, and then give it an extra 20 to bump it up to 93. Yeah, it's kind of a zero brain cell min-max situation, but I don't think there's any other stat distribution that's fitting for Vikavolt. As for moves it could get in its debut, I think Dazzling Gleam would be a good coverage move that sort of makes sense since I'd imagine its electric beams to be blinding. Speaking of beams, some projectile-based moves it could get are Power Gem, Focus Blast, and Electro Ball. Lastly, just as an obligatory addition, I have to give it U-Turn. Not only does it strangely never get this move, but with its high speed, it cannot properly use it if you need to switch out. But honestly, besides those minor tweaks, I don't think Vikavolt really needs much else. Its move pool is pretty good and Levitate is fitting, giving it a nice ground immunity. I don't know, maybe give it Volt Absorb if you want electric healing, but really, Vikavolt just isn't that bad. At least, it's not when compared to the rest in this video. Mushroom Pokemon tend to be very hit or miss. On one hand, you have awesome Pokemon like Breloom, but then you have Pokemon like Parasect and, more importantly, Shiinotic. It's a really cool design, especially when paired with its Pokédex entries. But unfortunately, as menacing as it looks, its stats say the opposite. I mean, wow, I didn't expect Shiinotic to be this bad when looking it up. This thing is on the same level as Pokemon such as Butterfree, Delcatty, and even Charjabug. Now, in the spirit of Morello being obtained early on, I don't want to make Shiinotic a beast, but a base stat total of 405 is just criminal, especially for a Gen 7 Pokemon. So I've decided to give it 20 more HP, 10 more special attack, and 10 more special defense. 445 is still pretty low, but it's much more viable than what it had before. For new moves, while Shiinotic has some cool options, there's definitely more it could get in relation to its behavior of sucking the life out of sleeping opponents and its dazzling lights. Firstly, I think some level up moves that would help it out on the utility side are Leech Seed to complement its defensive stat spread, Hex to synergize with Spore, Will-O-Wisp, and Heal Pulse since decks entries state that it can transfer energy to its allies if needed. For coverage, in reference to the light it can create, I think as a Morello it could get Psybeam and Mirror Shot, and then once it evolves, Flash Cannon, Focus Blast, and Signal Beam would help it out a lot. Finally, I think Trick Room would be nice to patch its low speed and because it uses Trickery to confuse its opponent. For abilities, while Illuminate is perfect design-wise, it's completely useless. I'd replace it with Regenerator since mushrooms are known to have regenerative properties, and it would work well with its increased HP stat, turning it into a frightening support Pokemon that can also deal devastating damage if it needs to, finally giving some justice to its spooky design. You know, I talked about Druddigon in my Fixing Gen 5 video and how it was one of the worst dragon types of all time. Well, today, I think there might actually be a competitor for that title, Turtonator. Starting with Goodra, it seems like Game Freak decided to continue the trend of giving the dragon type to Pokemon that aren't dragons at all. While Turtonator beats Druddigon in originality, it sadly offers very little in the way of desirability. Because not only is it a Pokemon Sun exclusive, it's only found towards the very end of the game, and once you catch it, you're met with what is essentially a Dragon-type Heatmor, and I think we all know just how underwhelming Heatmor is. To start, Turtonator is obviously meant to be a tank that can hit decently hard, and I don't want to take that trait away from it, so I just decided to give it 20 more HP and 10 more special defense. For new moves, Turtonator honestly has a pretty wide variety of moves as is, but some extras that would greatly help it out are Stealth Rock and Spikes, as a reference to the hard material on its shell, Sludge Wave because it's been referenced to excrete poisonous gas from its nostrils, Sucker Punch because of its behavior of waiting to trap prey, and Earth Power for better ground type coverage. Lastly, and most importantly, Turtonator needs a better ability. Sure, Shell Armor isn't terrible, but is blocking critical hits really that important most of the time? I think another ability that would fit is Solid Rock. Solid Rock is in reference to its rock-hard shell that it probably uses as a shield against attacks during fights, helping out its defensive shortcomings. Another ability that it could also get is Flame Body, punishing opponents that touch its dangerous shell. Sure, Turtonator won't be the greatest dragon type in Alola, but I think Game Freak really could have leaned more into its defensive stat spread to make it fare just a bit better in battle. Now that we're at Gen 8, I can finally give the reason why I decided to lump Gens 7 to 9 together into one video. You see, Gen 8 doesn't really have that many bad Pokemon. Sure, many of their designs suck, but gameplay-wise, most of them are perfectly fine and have some redeeming aspects or a gimmick that makes them interesting. But of course, there are still a few underwhelming ones. The first being Graplocked, a deep-sea Pokemon that surprisingly isn't a water type. Honestly, I don't have a big problem with that since it's cool seeing underwater Pokemon without the water type. Graplocked's main issue is that its move pool is pretty underwhelming, especially seeing how it gets Technician as a hidden ability, so let's fix that. First though, I'm just gonna bump its special defense by 10 to make it a bit bulkier against psychic attacks. I don't have a problem with it being slow since it's an octopus, so I wouldn't expect it to move very fast. The new moves I would give it would be Coil and Recover because of the flexibility and regenerative properties of octopuses, Storm Throw, Revenge, Flip Turn, Aqua Jet, and Bullet Punch for the Technician boost, Power Whip because it could probably use its arms as whips, then Lunge and Payback for some fighting style moves. Lastly, the only ability change I'd make is to make Technician a regular ability since hidden abilities are notoriously difficult to get even in the modern games. And Graplocked being able to unleash really powerful Storm Throws would give it a really unique niche amongst fighting-type Pokemon. Graplocked is a really cool and unique Pokemon, probably one of my favorites from Gen 8. It's just a shame that it got shafted so hard in the move pool department. Have you ever seen a Pokemon and thought to yourself, what in the world is that thing? Well, that's exactly what I thought of when I first saw Phalanx. Is it a worm? Is it an army of soldiers? Well, it's kinda both. I think the design is pretty cute and has an interesting, although one-dimensional gimmick in No Retreat, which boosts all of its stats but forces it to stay in battle until it faints. Unfortunately, Phalanx doesn't have the staying power to make good use of this move, and the first change I would make to it is to give it a secondary Steel typing. I've also seen Bug thrown around as another potential second type, but besides resembling a centipede, it's not actually a bug. I think adding the Steel typing would help it out defensively and differentiate it from all the other pure fighting types. As for stats, the only changes I'd make would be to take 10 special attack and give it to its physical defense, and then add on 20 special defense. I feel like Phalanx's design hints at it being a bit slow, but durable and fierce, like a group of heavily armored warriors. As for new moves, Phalanx is already pretty well off in coverage. However, the gimmick of No Retreat hints that it was designed with the playstyle of joining the battle and not leaving until it's over. So to illustrate this fearless nature, some thematic moves I'd give it are Flame Charge, Wild Charge, Attack Order, and Defend Order. I know that the two order moves are exclusive to Vespiquen, but Phalanx's whole design is centered around the leader directing the 5 other soldiers, so I don't think there's a better Pokemon to give these two moves to. I also want to give it Icicle Spear, Pin Missile, Rock Blast, and Spike Cannon both because of the spikes on their heads, but also because I want to give Phalanx an alternative niche. Just like with Turtonator, Battle Armor is an alright ability, and being immune to critical hits is better for Phalanx due to its gimmick, but I think a second ability that would help it out is Skill Link. I mean, what do Phalanx do when battling? They cooperate together and switch formations when needed, or in other words, they skillfully link together. These changes would go a long way in making Phalanx a unique, but more importantly, valuable member for any team. But that's it for Gen 8. Let's look at the newest batch of Pokemon, Generation 9. Generation 9 introduced a lot of things that people wanted for years, such as giving highly requested cross-gen evolutions to Pokemon such as Dunsparce and creating Pokemon with unique type combinations. Out of all of the brand new type combinations though, arguably the most hyped one was Grass-Fire, a type that Game Freak had been evading since Sunflora's introduction. Surely Game Freak had to have cooked something incredible, right? Well, we ended up essentially getting Carnivine with an extra fire typing. I mean, the stat distribution is weirdly similar, with Scovillain instead losing some bulk to get more speed. Unfortunately, that doesn't help it much because now it's just more frail while being at an awkward 75 base speed. Once again, I hate having to lean towards min-maxing, but with a Pokemon like Scovillain, we need to massively rework its stats. I take away 20 special attack and 10 speed, evenly distribute the stat points to its HP and defenses, and then add 10 more HP. Yeah, I know I'm making it slower, but given that it's supposed to synergize with Sunny Day, I don't think it's too big of a deal. Now, for moves, Scovillain kind of suffers here. To start things off, I feel like the reason why Scovillain is a mixed attacker is because of the lack of physical fire moves in general. Because fire-type moves are really the only ones that Scovillain uses its special attack stat for, but I don't think it's problematic to give it Flame Charge and Flare Blitz as physical fire attacks. After all, it's known to cause rampages due to the chemicals in its brain. Because of this behavior, I also think that giving it Wild Charge and Outrage would thematically fit and offer some nice coverage. In reference to its fangs, I think giving it Psychic Fangs and Thunderfang would also be nice. And lastly, for a Pokemon that learns multiple seed moves, I think it's weird that it doesn't get Leech Seed, which would give it some nice utility. Looking at Scovillain's 3 abilities, Chlorophyll is clearly its best ability, Moody can be chaotic if you're lucky, and Insomnia is nice to prevent sleep. My only change would be to replace Insomnia with Water Absorb, since I'd imagine Scovillain to be so hot to the point where water doesn't affect it. Besides that though, I think Scovillain now has some nice tools to help it stand out in battle, something that it greatly deserves being the first ever grass and fire type Pokemon. But now, we have the definitively worst Gen 9 Pokemon. As you might expect, it's a bug type, one whose unusability sits among the likes of other bugs such as Ledian and Kricketune. Yes, a Pokemon in Generation 9 who is as bad, if not worse, than Pokemon from 20 years ago, when Pokemon were much weaker in general. It's almost baffling how weak Game Freak decided to make it. But who is this Pokemon, you may ask? Well, it's none other than Spidops. Not only is it the least cool spider design, but it's probably one of the least cool bug type designs ever. And to top it all off, this thing has an abysmal 404 base stat total. I hate to say it, but I think even Ledian is more useful than Spidops, which is saying a lot. This thing needs a big makeover. Firstly, looking at its dex entries and stat distribution, Spidops is clearly meant to be a slow-acting Pokemon that can take a hit or two. While 92 and 86 aren't exactly terrible, they're not great either, especially with only 60 base HP. To help it out, I'd give it 10 more HP, 10 more physical attack, 20 more physical defense, and 6 more special defense. A 46 stat buff is big, but it's now equal in stats to Lokix, the other early game Gen 9 bug. Now for moves, while its coverage is surprisingly good, there's a few things it could get that fit the theme of it being a secret agent and trapper. The fact that it takes out prey before it notices makes giving First Impression, Fake Out, and Sucker Punch as level up moves instead obvious choices that help out its poor speed. Seeing that many of Spidops' attacks deal with striking or draining, I think Drain Punch would be a neat fighting type option. And finally, if you want to play a bit more defensively, Counter and Mirror Coat serve as a neat reference to its bulletproof vest design. The biggest change I want to make though is to its abilities. Insomnia is kind of unfitting. I'd instead replace it with Prankster if you want to use it for status moves, since Spidops uses Trickery to mess with its opponents. My second change would be to make Stakeout a regular ability and instead make its hidden ability Arena Trap. This makes perfect sense since its entire behavior is centered around trapping its prey, although it probably can only do that to terrestrial Pokemon. Sure, they're drastic changes, but for a Pokemon that borders on being Kricketune bad, drastic is exactly what you need. And that's it. All 9 generations of Pokemon. Throughout this journey, I've explored the good Pokemon and the bad Pokemon. I've gotta say, it was a lot of fun going back to Venture through every game. As time goes on, I've grown a new level of respect for Pokemon. It's a game that stuck with me throughout my life. It's something that resonates with me. Maybe it's the diverse world and mesmerizing fantasy that attracts me, or the simple, sometimes repetitive, but always infectious gameplay. Or maybe it's the good and the bad of it all. Just like in real life, it's all about venturing forward and growing. Where will the path take you? I don't know. Will these Pokemon eventually get the love they deserve? I also don't know. But for both instances, I'm positive that good changes are on the way, and things will be just fine.